When people imagine government overreach, they often think of surveillance networks or wartime limitations. Yet in 1933, the United States executed one of the boldest economic actions in its history. They didn't simply raise taxes or increase the money supply. They outlawed gold. They literally made it a crime for American citizens to possess the very asset that had supported their currency for more than 100 years. And the reason behind it exposes exactly how governments manipulate monetary systems when they reach a breaking point. This wasn't some distant policy argument quietly unfolding in Washington offices. This was the federal government stepping into your living room and ordering you to surrender your wedding band, your family's coin collection, the savings you had built up in precious metal. They handed out paper dollars in return and demanded trust. Most Americans obeyed. Those who didn't instantly became criminals. What makes this event so unnerving is the fact that it succeeded. The 1933 gold seizure wasn't just a disguised act of theft. It became the cornerstone of a monetary structure that still shapes your finances today. If you fail to understand how it unfolded, you miss the blueprint for every financial disaster that followed. Let's go back in time. By 1933, the United States was suffocating under the Great Depression. Banks were closing their doors every day. 1 in 4 Americans was unemployed. Families were losing homes, farms, and hope. Franklin Roosevelt had just assumed office, promising a New Deal to rescue the country. But behind the speeches and projects lay a financial architecture on the verge of implosion. The issue wasn't only economic. It was monetary. Since 1879, the U.S. had operated under the gold standard. Every dollar printed was backed by gold held in government vaults. Anyone could walk into a bank and exchange paper notes for real gold coins. This system had one feature that terrified lawmakers. It restricted how much currency the government could create. Under the gold standard, issuing more dollars required acquiring more gold to support them. That placed a natural limit on spending and monetary expansion. Politicians couldn't print their way out of crises. They couldn't inflate debts away or fund massive programs without sufficient gold reserves. For ordinary citizens, this meant their money maintained genuine value. A dollar today was worth roughly the same tomorrow because it represented a set weight of gold. But Roosevelt and his advisors had a very different view. To them, the gold standard was a straitjacket stopping them from taking the sweeping measures they believed were necessary to end the Depression. They wanted to cheapen the dollar to boost exports and raise prices. They wanted to print money to finance public programs and stimulate growth. The gold standard blocked all of this. So they resolved to destroy it. But they could not simply abandon gold while private citizens still owned it. As long as Americans had the right to redeem dollars for gold, the government's control over currency remained restricted. People would lose faith in paper notes and demand the real Metal instead. The only way forward was to remove gold from private ownership altogether. On April 5, 1933, Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102. The decree was staggering in both reach and boldness. It required all Americans to turn over their gold coins, bullion, and gold certificates to the Federal Reserve. By May 1 of that year, the punishment for refusal was a $10,000 fine and up to 10 years in prison. In today's terms, that fine would exceed $200,000. The order was not a suggestion. It was not a request. It was a mandatory directive, enforced by federal authority. Americans had mere weeks to give up gold they had saved across generations. Wedding rings and small personal ornaments were exempt, but virtually everything else had to be surrendered. The government paid $20.67 per ounce, the official rate. At that moment, most citizens obeyed. They stood in lines at banks and Federal Reserve branches holding bags and boxes of coins their families had preserved for decades. They watched clerks weigh their valuables and hand back paper notes. Many felt uneasy, but they did it. The alternative was becoming a federal offender. But here is where the manipulation turns truly dark. After the government absorbed the majority of the nation's gold, Roosevelt abruptly changed the rules. In January 1934, he signed the Gold Reserve Act, raising the official price of gold from $20.67 per ounce to $35 per ounce. Consider what that means. The government forced Americans to relinquish their gold at the lower price, then revalued the metal by nearly 70% shortly afterward. Those who surrendered their coins at $20.67 per ounce watched the government declare the very same gold worth $35 just months later. It was the largest transfer of wealth from private citizens to the federal government in U.S. history. The economic results were immediate and sweeping. By weakening the dollar relative to gold, Roosevelt made U.S. goods cheaper overseas. Exports began to recover. But the cost was carried by every citizen who had trusted the government and surrendered gold at artificially low rates. The emotional impact was even more profound. For the first time, Americans realized that the government could and would seize private property when it suited national objectives. The belief that gold ownership was a basic right, something no government would dare touch, collapsed. In 1933, Americans learned that no property, no matter how traditional or apparently secure, was outside federal reach. The confiscation itself was a masterstroke in messaging. Roosevelt did not describe it as theft or deception. He cast it as a patriotic sacrifice during a national crisis. Official statements called it a temporary measure to stabilize the currency and restore trust in banks. People were told their cooperation was essential for recovery. Newspapers and radio hosts praised those who willingly turned in their gold as model citizens helping rescue the nation. Those who hesitated were portrayed as selfish hoarders sabotaging Economic revival. The propaganda was brilliant and ruthless. It reframed confiscation as civic duty. But not everyone accepted the narrative. Some Americans immediately understood what was at stake and refused to comply. They buried gold in gardens, hid coins within walls, or shipped bullion to foreign vaults. These were not criminals or schemers. They were ordinary people who recognized that surrendering gold meant surrendering autonomy. The government's reaction was swift and unforgiving. Federal agents conducted searches of suspected hoarders. They examined homes, businesses, and safe deposit boxes. They offered rewards for informants who exposed neighbors. The Treasury formed a special unit devoted solely to locating and punishing people who resisted. One of the most famous cases centered on a lawyer named Frederick Barber Campbell, who contested the constitutionality of the order. He argued that the government had seized private property without due process and had no authority to do so under the Fifth Amendment. His challenge made him a target. Agents raided his office, took his gold, and prosecuted him. Campbell's case revealed the government's true intent. They were not interested in constitutional arguments. They intended to eliminate private gold ownership at any cost. Campbell lost his case, lost his gold, and became an example. The world watched the U.S. gold seizure with a mixture of fascination and alarm. European governments had manipulated currencies before, but nothing of this magnitude had ever been attempted by a major democracy. Some applauded Roosevelt's willingness to act decisively. Others saw it as a dangerous precedent that might be replicated in their own nations. What made the American move especially troubling was how efficiently it succeeded. Within months, private gold ownership had nearly vanished. Federal vaults filled with confiscated bullion while citizens held increasingly devalued paper notes. Other countries began studying the U.S. strategy, wondering whether they could escape monetary constraints through confiscation and revaluation as well. The economic ripples extended further than Roosevelt's advisors had expected. While exports strengthened, domestic prices rose sharply. Imported goods became more expensive. Families felt the burden in everyday purchases, from coffee to clothing. The promised recovery came at the cost of reduced buying power. Even more troubling was the shift in how Americans perceived money itself. Before 1933, gold had been synonymous with wealth for millennia. It was solid, limited in supply, and untouchable by political whims. After the confiscation, money became whatever the government declared it to be. Paper dollars no longer represented gold. They represented confidence in government authority. This transformation was gradual. Many older Americans continued to think in gold terms for years. But eventually, younger generations grew up, never knowing a world where money was redeemable for metal. They accepted paper currency as normal. They trusted banks and the government because they had never experienced an alternative. The long-term consequences surfaced. Decades later. Once Americans accepted that the government could seize gold in an emergency, they implicitly accepted the idea that no asset was truly private. The precedent set in 1933 would be invoked again throughout the 20th century. Property rights, privacy, and financial independence all became secondary to claims of government necessity. By 1971, Richard Nixon finished what Roosevelt began. He removed the dollar's last tie to gold, ending the international gold standard, and creating the modern fiat system. But Nixon's action was possible only because Americans had already been conditioned to accept government dominance over money. The gold seizure of 1933 laid the foundation for every monetary intervention that followed. The most disturbing element of this story isn't the fate of gold. It's the transformation of the American mindset. A nation that once fiercely guarded its financial independence learned to prioritize government assurances over tangible wealth. People who once saw gold ownership as a basic right accepted its banning as a temporary necessity. That temporary measure became permanent policy, and permanent policy became the accepted norm. The 1933 gold seizure wasn't just a Depression-era action. It was the moment America learned that government promises could outweigh private property rights, that emergency powers rarely disappear, and that citizens will sacrifice wealth if it is framed as patriotic duty. Roosevelt didn't merely prohibit gold. He rewired the country to accept government control over the entire monetary system. Every major financial crisis since has reused the same strategy: declare an emergency, require sacrifice from ordinary people, assure that the changes are temporary, and then make them permanent. The 2008 bailouts, the 2020 money creation, the endless growth of federal debt, all are direct descendants of what happened in 1933, when Americans accepted that gold could be taken for the greater good. They accepted that no asset was beyond government reach. History doesn't repeat itself exactly, but it echoes. And the echo of 1933 still lives in every dollar you spend, every promise issued from Washington, every crisis demanding your compliance. The real question isn't whether it could happen again. The real question is whether you'll recognize it when it does. If this revealed something about how power truly operates, hit subscribe. History holds the warnings. I'll show you where to find them.